Hello, this is Dr. Farley. Just a video about introductions and conclusions here. Hopefully it will help you guys with these difficult parts of the paper. All right, introductions. A few things to keep in mind here, not necessarily steps, but just some tips here. First is have a very clear idea of what you really want your paper to be about. What is it you really want us to learn from this paper? 2, decide what information we need to know about your subject. You're adding context, you're adding important information that will just help us to understand what is this issue about. 3, make sure we understand the impact your subject makes on society. You want us to understand, why is this important? That's the big question. All right. Thesis, I just want to guide you away from thinking of thesis as a singular statement, especially a statement that has the sort of A, B, C. I'm going to talk about A, B, and C in my paper. There's just all sorts of problems that come from that, mostly because you're trying to capture too much information all in one sentence, and you don't have to do it. It's not, you don't have a weaker introduction for doing it. You have a better introduction because you're using that entire space to kind of explain the concepts and context of what you're going to be talking about. Again, one thing to keep in mind here is that you don't want to get bogged down into technical details or so many things where, say you're talking about technological change in jobs. You don't want to talk about, percentages of factories run by automated and everything. None of those things really tell the story. What's actually happening to the people who used to work these jobs, and what happens to our society when an entire sector of people who had work don't now, and they cannot rely on things like this. What's the big impact? What's the human story in there? And once you capture that, you're really getting deeply into your subject. You should also understand the types of things you're arguing about. So if you think of a couple classic arguments or issues, say about First Amendment rights, a legal argument might be that, under the First Amendment, if you think of a case, say a Supreme Court case like Citizens United, they decided that corporations have a legal right to express their First Amendment, freedom of speech. And so that is the legal right. They can spend as much money as they can to talk about whatever issues they want. The ethical arguments, counter argument to that is that, you are opening the door to billions of dollars being spent by corporations to serve their own interests in elections and sort of by the elections and by the Congress, right? So one is a legal argument about just the nature of free speech and what it is. One is an ethical argument about the possible implications of that. So keep whatever types of appeal or types of argument. You need to sort of be conscious of how you're addressing particular issues. All right, some examples of ways that you might be able to begin your paper. I hope you find these helpful. One is beginning with an example. So say you're tackling a subject like police brutality, and you're going to use a particular case of that, say Eric Gardner. So this is going to be different than using an example in the body of your paper, which is going to support your information you're presenting here. In the introduction, you're still presenting those bigger concepts. You're taking, say, an event, or you're taking some of the aspects of something. So Eric Gardner, for instance, was selling loose cigarettes and ended up dead. And so you're talking about the concept of how the crimes don't fit the extrajudicial punishment, right? So, and now we're starting to ask those questions. Why do these things happen? How do they happen? Under what powers do police have? So we're able to explore all of these bigger questions about police brutality in and of itself, but we're using particular instances to pull out those big ideas in our introduction so that we can explore them in more detail in the rest of the paper. You can begin by defining a problem, and you can define a problem in a lot of different ways. These are just a couple of ways. These certainly aren't the only ones. Say you have a topic like climate change, for instance, and you can either talk about, say you're using your introduction to talk about the causes of climate change, greenhouse gases and CO2 and industrial emissions and transportation and all these other sort of things. And then these causes culminate in the effects. So and you use your paper and support of your paper to explore those effects. It's rising sea levels and extreme weather and etc. The flip side of that is you start with the effects. There's rising sea level, there's intense hurricanes, there are acidification of oceans, and coral reefs are dying, and habitat loss, and all sorts of things like that. Those are all the effects. So now you've invested us into the problems of climate change, and now you're using your paper to go back and talk about the causes. How did this happen? It happened because we started burning this, we used too much fuel here, oil and gas do this, etc. Both are perfectly legitimate explorations, just with a sort of different emphases. One is emphasizing the effects more, one's emphasizing the causes more. Beginning with the ending. So I kind of usually like to make a movie analogy here. If you think of a great movie with where you sort of see the very last scene of the movie first, and then the movie sort of jumps back in time, and then you slowly unfold how you got to that point, and then it all kind of makes sense at the end. It's a very dramatic way of kind of getting there. Maybe an example of this would be the cost of education. So you use your entire introduction, you're talking about how much students have to pay and how much debt they go into and how crippling this can be for students. And you're really just investing as this is a really big problem, right? You're talking about where we are now, and then you use your paper to kind of back up and say, 30 years ago, universities started investing in this, and this became a problem in education, and state funding was withdrawn, and et cetera, et cetera. And you're kind of talking us through how we got back to that point. But you started out with where we are now, and then you're going back in time and slowly bringing us back up to the present day. All right. Just a few things to keep in mind, because these are just a few things that students have done that I think are big mistakes. So hopefully you find this helpful as well. I know a lot of students who are used to the 5-paragraph model, which doesn't really use the introduction for anything. The introduction is just kind of a placeholder for the thesis statement that comes in the end. And I think that's another disadvantage of having the thesis statement. You're not seeing the entire introduction as something that's useful. And a lot of times people put in a lot of fluff information that's very vague to start out with. Like a typical sentence might look like this: technology has significantly changed in recent years. The problem with this is that you will have not gone from kind of A to B at the end of the sentence. You really don't know anything new when you finish reading it than you didn't know when you started. So about the paper, about anything. So it doesn't really actually say anything at all. So you really want to get right to the point, get right into your topic, and that's the most effective way. Be direct. Also, you should know your audience. A very, very important part about writing. Your audience, you can assume, is college educated, so they're going to know. You can assume that they would know about certain things, a certain amount of information. A common mistake, for instance, might be in the introduction. Students are writing about social media instead of getting into the context and the complex issues sometimes that social media raises. In their introduction, they're saying, Facebook is a program where you can post pictures and your friends can comment online and you can connect with your friends and family. And some very, very basic information about Facebook, which I believe everyone reading the paper would already have known in the first place. So if you can assume your audience already knows it, then you do not need to put it in your introduction. You're going to skip all that information and get deeper and get more detailed and specific. You also don't want to make your argument too early. You want to give us the context. So, say you're doing a paper about privacy of information online. We need to know what's actually happening in this issue. You're going to get into ideas of, say, identity theft and people losing money from their bank, people opening credit cards and someone else's information, or stealing their credit card information and buying certain things from it. All the different ways in which our data is stolen and used in these negative ways. And once you kind of invest this into kind of what's happening, that's the context of why information and privacy of our information is really essential. Then we can understand the issue, and then we can move on to supporting whatever your particular stance is about that issue. But if you're getting straight into what we should do, privacy is an issue, and now we're already kind of getting into the things we're kind of losing some of that context. We're not going to understand those solutions as well because we don't understand the problem first. All right, final conclusions. I would say if there's one word I'd like to embed in your mind here that was going to sum up my thoughts and your conclusions, it's that they should add to your paper. So it's really vital that, and one of the sad things about the 5-paragraph essay model is that it just kind of summarizes and restates. It doesn't add anything to your paper. You want your reader to continue to think about what you've written about in new ways. So say you have a problem, and it's, say, violence in Chicago, and you're getting down to the end, and everything you're talking about is the problems that exist, where they exist, kind of what's happening, and you get to the very end and you talk about solutions. But these are the things we can do about it. This program is doing this person is tackling this side of the solution, etc. And it recontextualizes everything we just thought about with those problems. Same with history. Say you have a history of this violence, and now we're talking about what's the legacy of this history. So you've talked about this entire thing that's happened in the past. What does it mean to people now? And that's your conclusion. Impact on society. Say we're, again, talking about violence in Chicago, and now we're, in our conclusion, talking about gun violence in the United States as a whole. So now we can kind of see how Chicago fits into this national picture, and how this is an issue that affects many people outside of the city limits here. Likewise, how do you think it is now? How do you think it will change? So, tackling that same subject, your entire paper is describing the things that are happening in Chicago and violence, and now when we get to the end, you're thinking about, in the next 25 years, these trends are seeing, and now we're kind of thinking this in a totally different light. How can this change? What are the things that are happening? How is it shifting? But again, that's conjecture, but it's just getting us to think about it in a totally new way. So that's what you really have to keep thinking back when you're in your conclusion. What have I added to this paper? How am I taking on new information, helping my reader think about what I've already written in new from new perspectives. All right, I hope you guys have found that very helpful. If you do have any questions about introductions and conclusions, or if you want to run ideas by me at any time, please let me know. That's what I'm here for. Thanks.